Good evening. This is James Stevens with Exploring God's Library. Please join us tonight as we do a reading. This is our third session from The History of the Plymouth Plantation by William Bradford, which is abridged by Daniel Webster, on the occasion of the 400th anniversary of the Puritans' landing at Plymouth Rock in America on November 11, 1620. Chapter 5. Showing what means they use in the preparation for this great voyage. And first, after humble prayer unto God for his direction and assistance, they consulted as to what particular place to decide upon. Some desired to go to Guiana, or some other of the fertile places in those hot climates. Others wanted to go to Virginia, where the English had already established themselves. Those who preferred Guiana asserted that the country was rich, fruitful, and blessed with a perpetual spring, where vigorous nature brought forth all things in abundance, without any great labor or art of man. So that it must needs make the inhabitants rich, as less provision of clothing and other things would be required than in colder and less fruitful countries. The Spaniards, having yet much more territory than they could possess, had not yet planted there, nor anywhere very near the same. For Virginia, on the other hand, it was objected that if they lived among the English who were settled there, or so near them as to be under their government, they would be in great danger of being troubled and persecuted for the cause of religion. In fact, quite as much so as if they lived in England, and it might be worse. And if they lived too far off, they should neither have help nor defense from them. At length, they came to the conclusion to live as a distinct body under the general government of Virginia, and through their friends to sue to His Majesty that he would be pleased to grant them freedom of religion, and they were put in good hope that this might be obtained by some great persons of good rank who were their friends. 2 were chosen and sent to England, at the expense of the rest, to solicit this favor. They found the Virginia Company very anxious to have them go there, and willing to grant them a patent with as ample privileges as they had, or could grant to any, and to give them all the assistance they could. But it proved to be a much harder piece of work than they expected, for although much was done to bring it about, yet it could not be effected. There were many of high standing who labored with the king to obtain the patent, and among these was one of the king's chief secretaries, and some even pled with the archbishop to grant their requests, but without success. They prevailed far enough to sound His Majesty's mind that he would not molest them, provided they conducted themselves peaceably. And this was all the chief of the Virginia Company, or any other of their best friends, could do. Yet they persuaded them to go on, for they presumed they should not be troubled. And with this answer the messengers returned and told what they had done. Other messengers were dispatched to conclude with the Virginia Company as well as they could, and to procure a patent with as good and ample conditions as they might by any fair means obtain, and to negotiate with such merchants and friends as had shown a desire to forward and take risk in this voyage. Chapter 6. Plans proposed by London merchants to assist in the undertaking. After this, they concluded both what number and what persons should go with the first, for all who were willing to go could not get ready in so short a time, neither, if all could have been ready, would there have been means to have transported them all at the same time. Those that remained, being the greater number, required their pastor to remain with them, and as for other reasons he could not go, it was all the more readily yielded. The others then desired Mr. Brewster, the elder, to go with them, which was also conceded. It was agreed on by mutual consent and covenant that those that went should be an absolute church of themselves, as well as those that stayed, as in such a dangerous voyage, and a removal to such a distance, it might happen that they should never meet again in this world. The proviso was made that as any of the rest of the home church came over, or any of the others returned at times, they should be reputed as members without any further dismission or testimonial. It was also promised to those who went first, by the body of the rest, that if the Lord gave them life and means and opportunity, they would come to them as soon as they could. About this time, while they were perplexed with the proceedings of the Virginia Company and were making inquiry about the renting and buying of shipping for their voyage, some Dutchmen made them fair offers about going with them. Mr. Thomas Weston, a merchant of London, came to Leyden about the same time, and after much conference with Mr. Robinson and others of their principal men, persuaded them to go on and not to meddle with the Dutch or to depend too much upon the Virginia Company. For if that failed, he and other merchants who were his friends, together with their own means, would set them forth, and they should fear neither want of shipping nor money, for what they wanted should be provided. Not so much for Mr. Weston as for the satisfying of such friends as he should get to venture in this business. They were to draw such articles of agreement and make such propositions as might better induce his friends to venture. Articles were drawn and were shown unto him and approved by him, and afterwards sent to England by their messenger, Mr. John Carver, who, together with Robert Cushman, was to receive the moneys and make provision both for shipping and other things for the voyage, with this charge not to exceed their commission, but to proceed according to the former articles. About this time they heard from Mr. Weston and others that sundry honorable lords had obtained a large grant from the king for the more northerly parts of the country, derived from the Virginia patent, and to be called New England. But now another difficulty arose, for Mr. Weston and some others who would favor this course, either for their better advantage or rather for the better drawing on others, as they pretended, would have some of those conditions that were agreed upon at Leyden altered. The chief and principal differences between these and former conditions were in these two points: that the houses and improved lands, especially gardens and home lots, should remain undivided wholly to the planters at the end of 7 years. Secondly, that they should have 2 days in the week for their own private enjoyment, for the more comfort of themselves and families, especially as had families. This is a history of Massachusetts by this person named Barry. This is kind of a side note to the reading about the Mayflower coming to America and all their preparations. And he said, quote, "Their greatest hardship was the compact, or the agreement, with the merchants. The Pilgrims were poor, and their funds were limited. They had no alternative, therefore, but to associate with others, and as often happens in such cases, wealth took advantage of their impoverished condition. By their instructions, the terms on which their agents were to engage with the merchants were definitely fixed, and no alteration was to be made without consultation. But time was precious. The business was urgent. It had already been delayed so long that many were impatient, and to satisfy the merchants, who drove their bargains sharply and shrewdly, some changes, compelled by the merchants, were made by Cushman, and by 10 tight articles the immigrants were bound for the term of 7 years. 7 years is I think a period of like you become a servant, or you're kind of indentured, I think, by some kind of an agreement for a 7-year period. Okay, chapter 7, departure from Leyden, arrival at Southampton, where they all met together and took in their provisions. So they're still in England. They haven't yet departed for the New World, but this is all getting ready. At length all things were ready. A small ship was bought and fitted out in Holland, which was intended to help transport them and to stay in the country and attend upon fishing and such other things as might conduce to the good of the colony. Another was hired in London, and all other things were got in readiness. So, being ready to depart, they had a day of solemn humiliation, and a part of the time was spent in pouring out prayers to the Lord with great fervency, mingled with abundant prayers. The time having come when they must depart, they were accompanied by most of their brethren out of the city to a town several miles off, called Delft Haven, where the ship lay ready to receive them. So they left that goodly and pleasant city, which had been their resting place for nearly 12 years. When they came to Delft Haven, they found the ship and all things ready. The night was spent with but little sleep to the most, but with friendly entertainment and Christian discourse and other real expressions of true Christian love. The next day, the wind being fair, they went aboard, and their friends with them, where truly doleful was the sight of that sad and mournful parting. To see what sighs and sobs and prayers did sound among them, what tears did gush from every eye, what loving speeches pierced each heart, moved many of the Dutch strangers who stood on the wharf as spectators. And they could not refrain from tears, yet comfortable and sweet it was to see such lively and true expressions of dear and unfeigned love. But the tide which waits for no man called them away, though they were loth to depart. Their reverend pastor falling on his knees, and they all with him, with watery cheeks, commended them with most fervent prayers to the Lord. Then, with mutual embraces and many tears, they took their leave one of another, and it proved to be the last leave to many of them. Then, hoisting sail, with a prosperous wind, they came in a short time to Southampton, where they found the larger ship, which had come from London, lying ready with all the rest of their company. After a joyful welcome and mutual congratulations, with other friendly entertainments, they began to talk about their business and to dispatch it with the greatest speed, and also with their agents about the alteration of the conditions. Mr. Carver pleaded he was employed here at Southampton and did not know what the other agent had done in London. Mr. Cushman answered that he had done nothing but what he was urged to do, partly on the ground of equity, but more especially by necessity, otherwise all had been dashed and many undone. And as to giving them notice at Leyden of this change, he could not on account of the shortness of the time. Besides, he knew it would trouble and hinder the business which had already been too long delayed for the season of the year, which he feared they would find to their cost. But these things did not give any satisfaction at present. Mr. Weston also came up from London to see them off and to have the conditions confirmed. But they refused and answered him that he knew right well that these were not according to the first agreement. Neither could they yield to them without the consent of the rest that were left behind. Indeed, they had special instructions when they came away, but from the chief of those who were left behind not to do it. At this he was much offended and told them they must expect to stand upon their own legs. So he returned in displeasure, and this was the first cause of discontent between them. And as they needed nearly 100 pounds to clear things at their going away, he would not take order to disperse a penny, but left them to shift for themselves as they were able. So they were forced to sell some of their provisions to stop this gap. They sold some 3 or 4 score firkins of butter, which commodity they could best spare, having provided too large a quantity. All things being now ready, and every business dispatched, the company was called together. Then they distributed their company for either ship as they considered best. They chose a governor and 2 or 3 assistants for each ship to order the people by the way and to attend to the disposal of their provisions. This being done, they set sail about the 5th of August. And then Motley comments on this. Quote, "The embarkation took place at Delft Haven. Delft Haven is an unimportant seaport on the long line of the Dutch coast, yet it is worthy of remembrance, for it marks the march of many toward the future and toward freedom. On the morning of the 22nd of July of the year 1620, a few persons on the quiet quay knew that a small bark of 60 tons called the Speedwell was preparing for a voyage. But whither and for what? She was no merchantman bound for gain, no privateer for plunder, no holiday sail for pleasure, no explorer for new continents. I'm going to add another chapter tonight because I think this will be really kind of an exciting place to be right now. Chapter 8, their departure from England and voyage to America. So here we go. Being thus put to sea, they had not gone far before Mr. Reynolds, the master of the small ship, complained that he found his ship so leaky that he did not dare to go further out to sea until she was repaired. So Mr. Jones, the master of the larger ship, being consulted with, both resolved to put into Dartmouth and have her examined. Some leaks being found and mended, it was thought by the workmen and all that she was seaworthy, and they might proceed without fear on the voyage. So with good hopes they put to sea again, imagining they could go comfortably on, and not expecting any more hindrances of this kind. But it happened otherwise. For after they were gone to sea again about 100 leagues from the land's end, keeping together all the time, the master of the small ship complained that his ship was so leaky that he must bear up or sink at sea, for they could scarcely free her with much pumping. So they consulted together again and resolved that both ships should go back up again and put into Plymouth, which accordingly was done. No special leak could be found, but it was judged to be the general weakness of the ship, and that she would not prove sufficient for the voyage. It was therefore decided to dismiss her and part of the company and proceed with the other ship. So after they took out such provisions as the other ship could well stow, and concluded what number and what persons to send back, they made another sad parting, one ship going back to London and the other proceeding on her voyage. These troubles blown over, and now all being compact in one ship, they put to sea again with a prosperous wind, which lasted 7 days, and was some encouragement to them. Yet according to the usual manner, many were afflicted with seasickness. After they had enjoyed fair winds and weather for a season, they would often encounter crosswinds and meet with many fierce storms, with which the ship would be greatly shaken. This caused them some fear that the ship would not be able to perform the voyage, but upon consideration, the master and others affirmed that they knew the ship was strong and firm under water. So they resolved to proceed. In some of these storms the winds were so fierce and the sea so high they could not bear a knot of sail, but were forced to hull for days together. In one of them, as they lay in a fearful storm, a strong young man, coming upon one occasion above the gratings, was by force of the waves washed overboard. He kept hold of the topsails halyards and was hauled up by the same rope to the edge of the water, and his life saved. In this voyage, but one passenger died. I'm going to do chapter 9 too, search for a landing. But to omit other things that I may be brief, after long beating at sea, they came to that land which was named Cape Cod, which being reached and certainly known, they were not a little joyful. After some deliberation among themselves and with the master of the ship, they tacked about and resolved to steer southward, the wind and weather being fair, to find some place about Hudson River for their habitation. But after they had sailed the course about half a day, they fell among dangerous shoals and roaring breakers, and were so far entangled therein that they thought themselves in great danger, and the wind dying away, they decided to turn towards the Cape again. The next day they got into the harbor, where they rode in safety. Being thus arrived in a good harbor, and brought safely to land, they fell upon their knees, and blessed the God of heaven, who had brought them over the vast and furious ocean, and delivered them from all the perils and miseries thereof, again to set their feet on the firm and stable earth, their proper element. Having thus passed the vast ocean, and a sea of troubles before in their preparation, they had now no friends to welcome them, nor inns to entertain or refresh their weather-beaten bodies, no houses, or much less towns to repair to seek for succor. It was winter too, and they who know the winters of the country know them to be sharp and violent, subject to furious storms, dangerous for travel from place to place, much more for searching an unknown coast. Besides, What could they see but a hideous and desolate wilderness full of wild beasts and wild men? If they looked behind them, there was the mighty ocean which they had passed, and which was now a barrier and a gulf to separate them from all the civilized world. If it be said they had a ship to succor them, it is true. But what did they hear daily from the master and company? That with their shallop they should, with speed, seek out a place, at some near distance, where they would be. For the season was such that he would not stir from thence till a safe harbor was discovered into which he might go without danger. Furthermore, the victuals, all the food, were being consumed, but he must and would keep sufficient for themselves and their return. What could now sustain them but the Spirit of God and his grace? May not the children of these fathers rightly say, Our fathers were Englishmen who came over this great ocean and were ready to perish in this wilderness. But they cried unto the Lord, and he heard their voice and looked on their adversity. And tonight that's where we'll end our reading, and then the next reading we'll read about the arrival at Cape Cod. So have a good evening. God bless you.